Well, here we are again, everybody. This is the last lecture I'm going to upload that's directly tied to one of our course readings. Won't be the last lecture for the whole semester, but it will be the last one where I'm breaking down one of the readings that we've done and looking at some of the highlights of it. This picture here is of Adam Jensen, the protagonist from Deus Ex Human Revolution and Deus Ex Mankind Divided. The premise behind Deus Ex Human Revolution is that Adam was a head of security personnel at Seraph Industries. Seraph Industries was developing some augmentation technology in the early 21st century, and at the very beginning of the game they're attacked by a mercenary hit squad, and some of their personnel are killed or kidnapped. Adam is severely injured in that portion of the game, sort of like the prologue, and he gets a bunch of enhancements, most of them mechanical in nature, like he's got essentially bionic arms, as you can see in the picture. And you play the rest of the game as him with these, enhanced abilities due to his augmentations. It's a very cool concept for a game, and it was generally really well received and well reviewed. One of the themes that undercuts that whole game is this underlying question of how the existence of these kinds of enhancements will affect existing social structures in society. And so concerns about inequality and about other potential long-term implications of the widespread distribution of this augmentation technology loom really large in the background of the game. And that in itself is pretty cool, independent of the gameplay itself. So if you're a gamer and you want to see a game that's directly related to some of this human enhancement stuff we've been talking about, Deus Ex Human Revolution, worth checking out. Probably very cheap now because it's kind of an old game. I think it's 5-6 years old at this point. But anyway, this isn't about the game specifically. This is about the inequality objection and Walter Veit's take on it. So as we get into this reading, I want to first just kind of put this paper in context. We've seen a lot of papers over the course of the semester, and while you may not have thought of them this way, there are basically 4 types of philosophy papers that we have seen. The first, and the most common, is one where you've got somebody presenting an original argument for a controversial view. So if we're thinking about this unit, Julian Savulescu's paper on procreative beneficence is a clear example of that, right? He's got an argument for this principle of procreative beneficence. That's a controversial view in kind of at the intersection of the ethics of procreation and the use of human enhancement. So fits easily into this first type. Second major type, a little bit less common, but still fairly common, is you've got somebody who is raising an objection to an established position or an established view. So Robert Sparrow, who was arguing against Savulescu's position, is a paradigm example of this second type, right? What was his main purpose in that paper? Well, he was trying to raise objections to Savulescu's position and to a lesser extent John Harris's position on human enhancement and genetic engineering of children. There's also a third type, which is where you try to defend an existing position from a well-known objection to that position. So this is the kind of paper that results from when, like, imagine if somebody were to try to respond to Sparrow's criticism on Savulescu's behalf. That would be an example of this third type of paper. And we've also seen a couple of times survey articles. Articles where the main point is not so much to present a particular position and defend it, but instead to just survey a wide range of different views on a controversial topic. This paper by Veit is a type 3 paper. It is a response to a well-known objection to a view on some controversial topic. So the view here is a pro-enhancement position or a transhumanist position, if we're thinking back to some of our vocab from this unit. And the objection is human enhancement is going to increase inequality. Or as he puts it, human enhancement will either create new inequalities or it will make existing inequalities worse in some way. So the original view we start with is transhumanist position in favor of human enhancement. Here's an objection, right? We should oppose human enhancement, at least broadly speaking, because it will increase inequality in one of these two ways. His paper is essentially an attempt to say, no, in fact, this inequality objection does not succeed. This is not a good reason to oppose the transhumanist position on human enhancement. So, how does he understand the inequality objection? Well, he is kind enough to give us a basic breakdown on page 405 of exactly how he thinks the argument is structured. So here we go. First premise, human enhancement accentuates existing inequalities. Now, I will make a note, if I were reconstructing this argument myself, the language would be a little different, but I'm taking this straight out of the text, just what he says on page 405. So, premise 1, human enhancement accentuates existing inequalities. Premise 2, inequality has a negative impact on society. Premise 3, new technologies that have a negative impact on society should be prohibited by policymakers. And conclusion, therefore, human enhancement should be prohibited by policymakers. So the way he understands the inequality objection is we're trying to move from a starting point of human enhancement increasing inequality to an ultimate conclusion that prohibition of human enhancement is the best way of countering this the inequality problem. Now, given that this argument has three premises, you can kind of guess that there are three pretty basic ways of challenging the argument. You could deny the empirical claim in premise 1, you could deny the substantive claim in premise 2, or you could deny premise 3. You could deny that prohibition is the best solution. And he tries to do essentially all of those things in the article. So let's look at the first premise. Human enhancement accentuates existing inequalities. Is that true or false? Now, first, as a kind of throwback all the way to Unit 1, recognize this is a non-moral premise. It is an empirical claim about the world. So the key to evaluating a premise like this, if we're thinking back all the way to Unit 1, is to figure out what facts and data we have that bear on the truth or falsity of this premise. And then we make a judgment on whether or not we think it really is true. One problem with evaluating this premise is that a lot of human enhancement that has been proposed doesn't exist yet. So we don't have actual real-world data on all of it. We have to be somewhat speculative in how we determine what the long-term impacts of these enhancements will be. So this isn't as straightforward as trying to say, get data on the effects of rising global temperature in, say, certain parts of the developing world, or in trying to make judgments about how many non-human animals are slaughtered in animal agriculture every year, or trying to make judgments about say population growth and how what the demographic trends are going to be for the rest of the 21st century. We don't have nearly as much data as we do with those issues when we're talking about human enhancement. So we've got to be somewhat speculative in how we assess the truth of this premise. But Veit does point out that there are at least some drugs that seem to have enhancing effects that appear to enhance equality rather than diminish it. One of his big examples in here is modafinil. I don't know if that's the correct pronunciation, but whatever, we're rolling with that. Modafinil is a drug that is typically prescribed for people who have narcolepsy or other sleep disorders. Kind of like coffee, it promotes wakefulness and increases your alertness. But that also means, similarly to coffee, that it can improve your focus and your cognitive ability even if you don't have any of those sleep disorders. So some people who don't have those disorders will still take the medication for its cognitive benefits. And modafinil is interesting because its effects, like some of the other cognitive enhancing drugs that we've talked about in this course, are felt far more strongly on people who have cognitive impairments than they are on people who have normal cognitive functioning. In other words, if these drugs were distributed to everybody in society, the people who would benefit the most from that arrangement are people who have deficits in their cognitive reasoning and their learning abilities. People who do not have those deficits, people who have normal cognitive functioning, would see very little or perhaps even no benefit from taking the drug. So the widespread use of a drug like this would seem to improve equality along the dimensions of cognitive functioning rather than diminishing it. The other thing that he mentions is specifically a throwback to this discussion about procreative enhancement, which is, if we're thinking about genetically altering the traits of children, we know way more about disease-carrying genes than we do about non-disease genes. So genetic enhancement, the main upshot is going to be lots and lots of people who would be born with debilitating diseases and similar genetic conditions simply won't have those conditions. They'll be relieved of having those conditions, and that will make it so that there are more people in society that have normal human capacities and normal functioning. People who would be born without those disease-carrying genes, they're not going to be affected at all. They're not going to be made better off, so to speak. They're going to stay exactly as they would have been otherwise. It's primarily the people who would suffer from these serious debilitating diseases who would benefit from widespread genetic enhancement. Now, obviously, if we come in the future to learn more about non-disease genes, all bets are off. Then at that point, maybe this point that he's making doesn't hold up as well. But it's been very difficult to pin down what genes, for example, lead to greater overall intelligence, or what genes have a strong bearing on your personality. The problem with that is, in those cases, environment plays a really big role in how your intelligence and your personality and certain other character traits develop. Whereas when we're talking about disease-carrying genes, it's pretty much just, with some diseases, it really is just your genetics. If we're talking about Tay-Sachs or we're talking about cystic fibrosis, your genetics play by far the overwhelming central role. And it doesn't really matter what environment you're in. It's really just about the genes in those cases. So these are interesting responses. They do make some headway in diminishing the worry, at least about certain types of enhancement leading to inequality. But this is I think very, very far from being a full throttle refutation of this first premise. He does mention also that many existing enhancements are very cheap, at least under current conditions. So this speaks to economic equality. You're not going to have to worry about all enhancements just being reserved for the super rich. There are lots of people who would be able to afford them. So again, that's not a blanket response that addresses every possible enhancement, but it gives us some reason to think that at least a certain class of enhancements aren't going to increase inequality along economic dimensions. Okay, so what about the second premise? Inequality has a negative impact on society. This seems really obvious if you just read it and think about it in the abstract. It's not very common for inequality to be a really good thing in a society. There are some exceptions. There are some cases where we want there to be certain inequalities. Like there are certain kinds of inequalities that work to everybody's advantage. If you doubt this, think about, for instance, doctors having a really, really high salary, right? They get paid more than most other professions. That's how it should be, though, because becoming a doctor requires an extraordinary degree of training and often requires taking on a lot of debt to pursue that training. So in order to incentivize people to actually go into the medical profession so that we have competent people working in our hospitals and treating illnesses, we need to give them a disproportionately large reward for doing so. One of those rewards can come in the form of a higher salary than they would have gotten if they pursued a different profession. So in that case, the doctors benefit from the inequality, like having higher pay, but ordinary people like me, for example, also benefit from that arrangement, because it means the people who are working in hospitals who might need to, say, perform surgery on me or prescribe me medications are better educated, better trained, and will be better able to look out for my well-being. So there are inequalities that can work to everyone's benefit, but widespread inequality in society is generally a source of suffering, oppression, unrest, and a variety of other things. So in general, inequality is not great. Veit doesn't really deny this. He essentially concedes the general point. His main strategy here is to point out that the benefits of enhancement could be so great that they morally outweigh the costs of increased inequality. He gives a few examples here. One is, he says, cognitively enhancing scientists could increase inequality in that it would, there would be a group of super smart scientists running around that wouldn't otherwise exist. But if those scientists are curing diseases, we might not care. Curing certain kinds of serious diseases might be such a big benefit that the loss in the diminished equality among people's cognitive abilities might be acceptable. He also mentions increasing the output of the labor force. That could potentially, if people are doing this on the basis of certain kinds of enhancements, cognitive or otherwise, that they've received, that may increase inequality, but it also might lead to superior economic growth, accelerated technological progress, or a variety of other benefits that could outweigh the costs associated with inequality. This is an interesting response, but I will say that I think the people who are most concerned about the inequality objection to human enhancement are not going to be persuaded by this, because those people are going to often be deontologists who don't think that concerns about inequality or other forms of injustice, they don't think that those kinds of concerns can be resolved by just running a cost-benefit analysis and trying to quantify the cost of inequality or injustice. This is not the framework in which these people operate, right? That's a consequentialist framework. So I'm skeptical that this kind of response is going to be persuasive to anybody who's not already kind of approaching inequality through a consequentialist lens. I think that's a serious limitation of the framework that Veit is using here. So my diagnosis, first response, not super persuasive, at least not for all enhancements. Second, his appraisal of the first premise, I think, is not totally sufficient to undercut the inequality objection. I definitely don't think that this second premise, that trying to undermine the second premise, is very effective. So that leaves the third premise. How well does he do on that one? So here's the third premise. New technologies that have a negative impact on society should be prohibited by policymakers. What Veit tries to do here is establish that even if you're on board with the first two premises in the inequality objection, that's not a strong enough reason to think the argument succeeds, because prohibition may not, in fact, be the best strategy. One point he makes is that if you prohibit enhancement, you might just see the development of a black market for human enhancements, and that's where people will go to purchase them. This would be bad for a number of reasons. Black markets tend to be associated with criminal activity since they are inherently illegal. But beyond that, you're also going to have a lack of regulation. People are going to have to pay more money for enhancements, and you're also going to have situations where people who would benefit the most from enhancements may not be the ones who are going out of their way to acquire them. So you're also foregoing some of the potential benefits from enhancements that could be reaped if those enhancements are available on a more open market. The other major challenge is that any kind of widespread prohibition is going to have to require some kind of clear and coherent set of criteria that we use to separate acceptable enhancements from unacceptable ones. So one example he gives is coffee. Coffee is, in a way, a type of enhancement. It's a cognitive enhancer, or at least it functions that way for a lot of people. I don't think that anybody would seriously believe that coffee ought to be prohibited, such that it's under the big umbrella of items that get banned if we're enacting a prohibition on human enhancements. But how do we separate an enhancer like coffee from other enhancers that we're prohibiting? That may not be impossible to do, but it would be extremely difficult, because you'd need to have some kind of consistent set of criteria that separate the acceptable enhancements from the unacceptable ones. As far as an objection goes, I don't think this is a totally decisive refutation of the inequality objection, but it does sort of raise a significant practical question. How exactly would we craft a policy that would actually make sense in terms of what enhancements we prohibit and which ones we don't? There's also a concern about enforcement and about whether the enforcement could be done globally. So suppose you live in the European Union somewhere. Maybe you happen to live in Italy, and in Italy they decide, we're going to ban all these enhancements. But it turns out that Switzerland didn't ban those enhancements. So you just get in your car, you drive to Switzerland, purchase some enhancements there. How are you going to prevent that sort of thing from happening? You would need some kind of international coordination to make this work. And the chances of that developing seem pretty low, or at least it would require a great deal of coordination. And global consensus on anything is extremely hard to get. Global consensus on what human enhancements gets prohibited under this hypothetical policy seems extremely doubtful. So between these 3 points that Veit makes, I think he's got a fairly strong case here. There are some good reasons to think that there would be a lot of practical challenges associated with trying to enact a prohibition that is not only consistent and globally enforced, but also effective at actually eliminating enhancements from the world. I mean, when we go back in time and we look at, whenever prohibition comes up, people always, in the United States, we always look at the prohibition on alcohol and what the results of that were. And the prohibition on alcohol did not prevent the use of alcohol. It just created, it made it harder to get, but it was something that people really, really wanted. And it was tremendously ineffective at preventing the people who wanted it from actually getting access to it. So, is that what we would see with respect to human enhancement? Would it be similar? Well, I'm not sure. This is a tough question to answer in the abstract. But there's at least some reason to be skeptical that you could engage in the kind of prohibitive policy that would be effective and get you the results that you want. So, one of the obvious questions that follows from this observation is, could we do better? Is there an alternative policy that we could enact that would reduce some of the potential concerns about inequality that are tied to human enhancement without going full-blown prohibition? One way you could try to do it would be to subsidize enhancements or find some other way of giving free access to enhancements for poor families or other people of lower socioeconomic status. This would eliminate some concerns about economic inequality. Another proposal that Veit mentions briefly, and I mean very briefly, there's only one paragraph where he brings up these points about alternative policy measures. One proposal, use some kind of an intermediary market scheme in between prohibition and a fully open market. So don't just allow enhancements to be freely regulated by the market forces in the background. Don't just treat them like they're any other item or object that's being purchased. But also don't engage in some full-scale prohibitions. So perhaps have more government intervention and monitoring of enhancements than you would for other kinds of products. And one of the things that I thought about here that might be related to this intermediary market, this is not a point that Veit makes in his article, maybe you could have a selective prohibition. Maybe there would be certain kinds of enhancements that we really think would simply be too dangerous or too extreme to allow them to be legal at all. But that other enhancements could be legal and could be subject to a less severe degree of regulation. So what kinds of enhancements might we prohibit? Well, certain kinds of really, if we were to discover that there were certain enhancements that had, say, really, really high risks of negative health effects, or really high risks, say maybe there are cognitive enhancers that really increase the likelihood of people developing mental illnesses as a result of prolonged use. Those would strike me as good candidates for things that maybe we just prohibit those enhancements. We simply make them illegal. I remember I made a reference to the movie Limitless at some point before spring break. And in the movie Limitless, there's an experimental enhancing drug that really increases your cognitive abilities dramatically. It's NZT is the drug in that fictional universe. But it also has a side effect that if you take it for a prolonged period of time, it seems to inevitably lead to your death. It causes you to age pretty rapidly and will almost surely kill you. And that becomes, the main character winds up taking NZT and kind of figuring this out. And part of the big part of the movie is, can he wean himself off of NZT before the drug kills him? That would strike me as a good candidate for a drug that should be prohibited because of the health effects and the really dangerous risk there. So I think that what we get when we reflect on this inequality objection is, it's a serious concern. There may be ways to mitigate it or reduce inequality created by human enhancements such that the legalization of at least some of them is permissible, but it would require a great deal of work and caution at the policy level. And doing that, it's possible, but that's very much a work in progress. And from a practical standpoint, I think that's where a lot of work in the future, not the immediate future, but in 20, 30, maybe 50 years, when we start to see more enhancing drugs and potentially more enhancement-based procedures becoming technologically feasible, that's where I expect a lot of the work will have to be, is how do we design social policies that allow us to benefit from the existence of these new technologies and new drugs while simultaneously curtailing the negative impacts, including the risks associated with increased inequality. So I think that's more or less where that leaves us, and I realize that this is the last official assigned reading in the course, and so it might be a little bit disappointing that it kind of ends on that kind of ambiguous cliffhanger, but that's the way philosophy goes. Philosophical questions rarely have straightforward, clear-cut answers. Human enhancement debate is no different. So this is not the last lecture that I'll upload for this course, but it is the last one over the readings. I hope that these lectures have been informative and that you've been able to use them to engage with the reading at a little bit deeper level.